The morning sun peeked over the eastern hills as Thomas Wilson stood on his front porch, coffee mug in hand, surveying the land he now called home. At 45, the retired Army engineer had finally achieved what many would call the American dream. 15 acres of good Texas land with rolling hills, a small creek cutting through the southern edge, and enough space to finally breathe freely after 20 years of military service. Thomas took a deep sip of his coffee, the steam rising against the cool morning air. 6 months had passed since he'd purchased this ranch, and every morning still felt like a gift. The property wasn't fancy by any means. The main house needed work, the barn had seen better days, and the fencing required constant attention. But it was his. All his. What do you think, Duke? Should we fix that south fence today? Thomas asked, glancing down at the German shepherd sprawled at his feet. Duke lifted his head, ears perking up at his owner's voice, before letting out a lazy yawn that made Thomas chuckle. The ranch had been a working cattle operation decades ago, long before the nearby town of Willow Creek had expanded toward it. Thomas had stumbled upon the listing by chance while preparing for retirement. The property had been on the market for nearly 2 years, with most potential buyers put off by the amount of work needed to restore it. But where others saw problems, Thomas saw potential. He walked down the porch steps, boots crunching on the gravel path that led to his workshop. The morning dew still clung to the tall grass beyond his yard, catching the sunlight and turning the fields into a sea of diamonds. Duke trotted alongside him, occasionally darting off to investigate interesting smells. The workshop had once been a small stable, but Thomas had converted it during his first month of ownership. Inside, the walls were lined with neatly organized tools, a habit he couldn't shake from his military days. On the large central table lay his current project, detailed plans for renovating the old barn into a proper workshop and garage. Thomas spread the papers out, making a few adjustments to his measurements. His engineering background had proven invaluable in his new life as a rancher. Every problem had a solution. It was just a matter of finding the right approach. A notification chime from his phone interrupted his concentration. It was a reminder about the fence materials he'd ordered, scheduled for delivery that afternoon. Thomas walked back to the house to grab his truck keys, planning to check his property line before the delivery arrived. The ranch sat about 2 miles from the main road, connected by a long driveway that wound through stands of oak and pecan trees. At the entrance to his property, Thomas had installed a simple but effective electric gate with a keypad. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep unwanted visitors out and his privacy intact. As he drove along his fence line, Thomas could see the newer development of Oak Ridge Estates in the distance. The subdivision had sprung up about 3 years ago, according to his neighbor Bill Chen, who owned the small organic farm adjacent to Thomas's eastern boundary. The contrast between the cookie-cutter houses with their manicured lawns and his rugged, natural property couldn't have been more stark. "They'll be wanting to annex you next," Bill had joked when they first met. "Those HOA types can't stand seeing land that isn't under their control." Thomas hadn't thought much of the comment at the time. He'd dealt with far worse than nosy neighbors during his military career. Besides, his property predated the subdivision by decades and was separated from it by a county road and a natural creek boundary. There was no legal way they could force him to join their community. Near the southern fence line, Thomas spotted the issue he'd been meaning to fix. Several posts had begun to lean after the heavy rains last month. He made a mental note of the materials he'd need, snapping a few photos with his phone for reference. On his drive back to the house, Thomas passed the small pond where he'd been teaching himself to fish. His father had been an avid fisherman, but military deployments had left Thomas with little time to learn the skill himself. Now he had all the time in the world to figure it out. The ranch represented more than just a place to live. For Thomas, it was the promise of a future he'd often doubted he'd have. During his third tour overseas after a particularly close call, he'd started dreaming about a piece of land somewhere quiet. Somewhere he could wake up to bird songs instead of shouted orders, where the only deadlines were set by the seasons. Back at the house, Thomas checked his email and found a message from his real estate attorney confirming that the property tax assessment had been completed. The taxes were higher than he'd initially budgeted for, but still manageable with his military pension and the small consulting business he ran in his spare time. The delivery truck arrived promptly at 1 o'clock, Thomas opened his gate remotely using the app on his phone and directed the driver where to stack the materials near the workshop. As they unloaded the fence posts and wire, Thomas noticed a sleek white SUV slowing down as it passed his open gate. The vehicle lingered longer than normal. Curiosity would warrant before continuing down the road toward Oak Ridge Estates. Nice place you got here, the delivery driver commented, as Thomas signed for the materials. Lot of work, but worth it, I bet. Every minute, Thomas agreed. Been fixing it up bit by bit. Wish I had the skills for that. My wife says I can barely hang a picture straight. The driver laughed. You out here all by yourself? Thomas nodded. Just me and Duke for now. Got family in Houston who visit sometimes. After the delivery truck left, Thomas closed his gate and returned to the stack of materials. As he began sorting through the fence posts, he couldn't shake the feeling that the white SUV had been casing his property. Living alone in a rural area, security was always a concern. Though Willow Creek had a relatively low crime rate. That evening, as the sun began to set, Thomas sat on his back porch with a plate of grilled chicken and vegetables. Duke lay at his feet, occasionally looking up hopefully for a handout. The distant sounds of wildlife preparing for night created a peaceful backdrop to his meal. Thomas had just finished eating when his phone rang. It was Bill. Hey neighbor, just giving you a heads up, Bill said after they exchanged greetings. There was some lady asking about you at the feed store today. Said she was from the Oak Ridge HOA and wanted to know who owned that large undeveloped property by the creek. Thomas frowned. What did you tell her? Nothing much. Just that you bought it fair and square and were fixing it up nice. She seemed real interested in whether you were planning to subdivide or sell any parcels. Not a chance, Thomas said firmly. This place stays exactly as it is. That's what I figured, Bill chuckled. Just thought you should know. These HOA types can be persistent when they get an idea in their head. After they hung up, Thomas sat in thoughtful silence. He'd dealt with all types during his military career. Difficult superiors, challenging teammates, hostile locals in foreign countries. A nosy HOA president hardly registered on his scale of potential problems. Still, as he watched the last light fade from the sky, Thomas made a mental note to check his security cameras and perhaps add a few more around the property. Not out of fear, but from the habits of preparedness that had kept him alive through 3 tours of duty. In the military, he'd learned that anticipating problems was always better than reacting to them. Duke suddenly perked up, ears forward, staring into the darkness beyond the porch light's reach. Thomas listened but heard nothing unusual. After a moment, Duke relaxed again, returning to his half-dozing state. Just a deer, buddy? Thomas asked, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. Or are you sensing trouble coming our way? The dog looked up at him with loyal brown eyes that seemed to say he'd be ready either way. Thomas smiled. Whatever came next, fence repairs, nosy neighbors, or HOA drama, he'd handle it. This ranch was his sanctuary, his reward for years of service, and he'd protect it just as diligently as he'd protected his country. As stars began to appear in the clear night sky, Thomas leaned back in his chair and allowed himself to feel the simple contentment that had eluded him for so much of his life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, this moment was perfect. Thomas first noticed the white SUV 3 days after his conversation with Bill. He was replacing the hinges on his front gate when the vehicle slowed to a crawl as it passed his property. This time, instead of continuing on, it pulled over onto the shoulder of the road, and a woman stepped out. She was in her early 50s with perfectly highlighted blonde hair cut in an expensive-looking bob. Her cream-colored pantsuit looked out of place against the dusty rural backdrop, and the large designer sunglasses covering half her face suggested she wasn't from around these parts. "Excuse me," she called out, waving a manicured hand in Thomas's direction. "Property owner. A word, please." Thomas straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. Duke, who had been lounging in the shade of a nearby tree, stood at attention, watching the stranger with wary eyes. "Can I help you?" Thomas asked, walking toward his property line but stopping short of the actual road. The woman approached the fence, her high heels wobbling slightly on the uneven ground. "I'm Patricia Reynolds, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." She extended her hand over the fence, clearly expecting Thomas to shake it. After a moment's hesitation, Thomas did, noting her firm grip and the way her eyes scanned his property with obvious disapproval. "Thomas Wilson," he said simply. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Reynolds?" "Ms.," she corrected automatically. "I've been meaning to introduce myself. We're neighbors, after all." Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "I understand you purchased this property about 6 months ago." The way she said property, as if it were a questionable purchase, put Thomas immediately on guard. "That's right," he said. "It's been a good 6 months." Patricia nodded, her gaze now fixed on the half-finished fence repairs. "I see you're making some improvements. That's good, very good. We at Oak Ridge are quite concerned with neighborhood aesthetics, you understand." Thomas fought to keep his expression neutral. "My ranch isn't part of Oak Ridge Estates, Ms. Reynolds. It's private property well outside your HOA boundaries." Patricia's smile tightened. "Technically, yes. But surely you understand that your property's appearance affects our community's overall value. We're a premium development. Our homeowners pay top dollar for their properties, and they expect certain standards to be maintained in the surrounding area. I keep my place tidy," Thomas said. "But it's a working ranch, not a suburban showcase." "Yes, well, about that." Patricia reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a glossy brochure. "I've brought you our community guidelines. Just as a courtesy, you understand. There are several sections about exterior maintenance, acceptable fencing styles, and property upkeep that you might find informative." Thomas didn't take the offered brochure. "Again, Ms. Reynolds, my property isn't part of your HOA. Your guidelines don't apply here." Patricia's smile vanished completely. "Mr. Wilson, I don't think you understand. Oak Ridge Estates represents over 200 families. We have significant influence with the county commissioners. It would be in your best interest to cooperate with our community standards." Before Thomas could respond, a delivery truck approached, slowing as it neared his gate. Thomas used his phone to open the electric gate, momentarily turning away from Patricia. That was all the opening she needed. To Thomas's astonishment, Patricia quickly walked around the fence post and through his open gate, heading up his driveway as if she'd been invited. "Hey," Thomas called after her. "You can't just... I'll just take a quick look around while you handle your delivery," she called back over her shoulder, already 20 yards up his driveway. "Don't mind me." Thomas was torn between chasing after her and dealing with the delivery driver, who was now pulling up to the gate with a truckload of lumber Thomas had been waiting on for his barn repairs. "Just pull through and follow the driveway to the main house," Thomas instructed the driver, his jaw tight with frustration. "I'll be right there." By the time Thomas had directed the driver where to unload and signed for the delivery, Patricia had disappeared from view. Duke stayed by Thomas's side, picking up on his owner's tension. "Come on, boy," Thomas muttered. "Let's go find our uninvited guest." They found Patricia near the old barn, taking photos with her phone. She didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed when Thomas approached. "This structure isn't up to code," she said by way of greeting, gesturing to the barn, "and those old tractor parts by the side are an eyesore. Not to mention a safety hazard." Thomas took a deep breath, counting to 5 in his head before responding. "Ms. Reynolds, you are trespassing on private property. I didn't give you permission to enter my land, and I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Now." Patricia looked at him as if he were being unreasonable. "I'm only trying to help, Mr. Wilson. As HOA president, it's my responsibility to ensure that all properties in and around our community meet certain standards. Your responsibility ends at your subdivision boundaries," Thomas said firmly. "Now please leave or I'll have to call the sheriff." "That won't be necessary," Patricia sniffed, sliding her phone back into her purse. "I was just leaving anyway. But do consider what I said about those community guidelines. It would make things much easier for everyone if you'd voluntarily comply." Thomas escorted her back to the gate, making sure she actually left this time. As she got into her SUV, she rolled down the window. "I'll be checking back to see what progress you've made," she called out. "The county health inspector is a good friend of mine. He might be interested in some of what I saw today." With that parting threat, she drove away, leaving Thomas standing at his gate with a mixture of disbelief and anger. That evening, Thomas called Bill to tell him about the encounter. "She actually came onto your property without permission?" Bill asked, sounding genuinely shocked. "Walked right through my open gate like she owned the place," Thomas confirmed. "Started taking pictures of my barn, telling me it wasn't up to code." Bill let out a low whistle. "That's Patricia Reynolds for you. She's been HOA president for 2 years now, and from what I hear, she's made everyone's life in that subdivision a living nightmare. Fines for grass being half an inch too tall, citations for having the wrong shade of beige on your mailbox, that kind of thing. Well, she's barking up the wrong tree with me, Thomas said. I've dealt with dictators in 3 different countries. An HOA president doesn't scare me. But over the next 2 weeks, Patricia proved to be more persistent than Thomas had anticipated. Twice more, she managed to slip onto his property when the gate was open. Once when Thomas was leaving to go into town, and again when a friend was visiting and left the gate open behind them. Each time, Thomas would find her wandering his property, taking photos and making notes. Each time he would escort her off, his patience wearing thinner. After the 3rd incident, Thomas decided to take action. He installed security cameras at his gate and at strategic points around his property. He also posted clear no trespassing signs at regular intervals along his fence line. When Bill came over to help with the barn roof repairs the following weekend, Thomas showed him the new security setup. Think it'll keep her out? Bill asked, eyeing the cameras. If it doesn't, at least I'll have evidence for the sheriff, Thomas replied, and I've got a few other ideas up my sleeve if it comes to that. They were taking a break, drinking cold lemonade in the shade of an oak tree, when Thomas's phone chimed with a security alert. He checked the camera feed to see Patricia's white SUV parked at his gate. This time she had another woman with her, equally well-dressed and looking just as out of place against the rural backdrop. The camera's microphone picked up their conversation. "This is the property I was telling you about, Helen," Patricia was saying. "Completely undermaintained, and the owner is utterly uncooperative." "I see what you mean," the other woman replied, peering through the gate. "The board should definitely discuss this at our next meeting. Perhaps we could petition the county for an ordinance about properties adjacent to planned communities." Thomas looked at Bill, who shook his head in disbelief. "She just doesn't give up, does she?" Bill remarked. "No," Thomas said, his voice calm but determined. "But neither do I." Later that evening, after Bill had gone home, Thomas sat at his kitchen table with Duke at his feet. He spread out a notepad and began drawing. 20 years in military engineering had taught him that for every problem, there was a solution. Sometimes that solution required thinking outside the box. Patricia Reynolds might have the county commissioners in her pocket. She might have an army of HOA members behind her. But Thomas had something she didn't, the knowledge and skills to protect what was his. As he sketched out his plan, a slow smile spread across his face. If Patricia wanted to keep driving through his gate uninvited, he'd make sure she remembered the experience for a long, long time. The next morning, Thomas called the county sheriff's office. After explaining the situation to 3 different people and being put on hold twice, he finally got through to Deputy Rodriguez, who seemed to take his complaint seriously. "So this woman has entered your property without permission multiple times?" the deputy asked. "3 times that I know of," Thomas confirmed. "I have it on camera now. She waits until my gate is open and just drives right in like she owns the place." "And you've asked her not to enter your property?" "Every single time," Thomas said. "I've been clear that she's trespassing." Deputy Rodriguez promised to send someone out that afternoon to take a formal report. True to his word, a patrol car pulled up to Thomas's gate around 2 o'clock. Thomas let the officer in, a young deputy named Walsh who looked like he might have graduated from the academy last week. Thomas showed Deputy Walsh the security footage of Patricia's unauthorized entries onto his property. The young officer took notes and photographs, but his expression was less than encouraging. "Technically, this is trespassing," Walsh admitted. "But in cases like this between neighbors, the department usually recommends trying to work things out privately first." "I've tried," Thomas said. "She doesn't listen." Deputy Walsh shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Mr. Wilson, I'll file the report. But I should warn you, Ms. Reynolds has a lot of pull with the county commissioners. Her husband golfed with the sheriff for 20 years before he passed. Just, something to keep in mind." Thomas thanked the deputy for his honesty, if nothing else. After the patrol car disappeared down his driveway, he called his friend Mike Taylor, who practiced law in Houston. "Trespassing case against an HOA president?" Mike chuckled after Thomas explained the situation. "Oh man, those are always fun. So people think they're above the law. So what can I do?" Thomas asked. "The sheriff's department isn't exactly falling over themselves to help. Send her a certified cease and desist letter. Mike advised. I can draft one for you. It probably won't stop her. But it establishes a paper trail that you've formally warned her to stay off your property. That'll help if this ever goes to court. And what are the chances of that happening? Honestly, unless she damages something or threatens you physically, most courts treat these as minor civil disputes. They'll tell you both to act like adults and work it out. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. So she can just keep coming onto my property and there's nothing I can do about it? I didn't say that, Mike replied. There are plenty of things you can do. I'm just saying the legal system might not be your best first option. The cease and desist letter arrived by email the next day. Thomas printed it, signed it, and sent it by certified mail to Patricia Reynolds at the Oak Ridge Estates HOA office address. He also printed extra copies and posted them alongside his no trespassing signs. For 2 blessed weeks, there was no sign of Patricia or her white SUV. Thomas began to hope that perhaps the official-looking legal letter had done the trick. He focused on his barn renovation, making good progress now that the lumber had arrived. Then came the Oak Ridge Estates quarterly newsletter. Bill brought it over one evening, his face grim as he handed the glossy printed booklet to Thomas. You're going to want to see page 3, he said. Thomas flipped to the page and felt his blood pressure rise immediately. There, under the headline, Community Safety Concerns, was a thinly veiled article about his property. Residents should be aware of the unregulated and potentially hazardous rural property adjacent to our eastern boundary, the article began. This property, which features numerous code violations and unsafe structures, poses a risk to our community's safety and property values. The article went on to claim that abandoned farm equipment, improperly maintained fencing, and questionable land use practices created dangers ranging from potential flooding issues to fire hazards. It ended by encouraging residents to report any concerning activities to the HOA board, though the article never mentioned Thomas by name or gave his exact address. Anyone familiar with the area would know exactly which property they meant. This is defamation, Thomas said, his voice quiet with anger. Bill nodded. That's what I thought too. But she was careful not to name you directly. She's trying to turn the whole neighborhood against me, Thomas said, scanning the article again. Listen to this. The property owner has been uncooperative with community efforts to address these concerns. That's a flat-out lie. She trespassed on my land and I asked her to leave. That's it. What are you going to do? Bill asked. Thomas folded the newsletter and set it aside. I'm going to their next HOA meeting. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA held their meetings in the community clubhouse, a building that looked more like a small corporate headquarters than a neighborhood gathering place. Thomas arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in clean jeans and a button-down shirt, respectable but still authentically himself. The room was already half full of residents, most in business casual attire. Conversations quieted as he entered, and several people turned to stare. Thomas nodded politely and took a seat in the back row. Patricia arrived 5 minutes later, flanked by 2 other board members. She froze momentarily when she spotted Thomas, then whispered something to the woman beside her. They took their places at the table facing the residents. Welcome to the Oak Ridge Estates quarterly HOA meeting, Patricia began, her voice carrying the practiced tone of someone used to running meetings. We have a full agenda tonight, so let's get started. Thomas sat quietly through discussions about community pool maintenance, a proposed update to the landscaping along the main entrance, and a heated debate about whether residents should be allowed to park work vehicles in their driveways overnight. Finally, Patricia reached the community safety portion of the agenda. As many of you read in our newsletter, we have some concerns about the adjacent rural property to our east, she began. The board has documented numerous potential hazards that could affect our— Excuse me, Thomas interrupted, standing up. Since I'm the owner of that property, I'd like to address these concerns directly. A murmur ran through the room as residents turned to look at him. Patricia's smile was tight. This is a closed meeting for Oak Ridge Estates residents and homeowners only, Mr. Wilson. You made my property a topic of discussion in your meeting and your newsletter, Thomas replied calmly. I believe that gives me the right to respond. An older gentleman in the front row nodded. I'd like to hear what he has to say, Patricia. Several other residents murmured in agreement. Patricia looked like she'd swallowed something sour, but she gave a curt nod. You have 2 minutes, she said. Thomas walked to the front of the room and turned to face the residents. My name is Thomas Wilson. I bought the ranch east of here after retiring from 20 years of military service. I've been working to restore it, and I take pride in my property. He paused, making eye contact with several residents. The newsletter article about my land contained several false statements. My property is not hazardous, it doesn't violate any county codes, and it certainly doesn't pose a risk to this community. He pulled out his phone. What is true is that your HOA president has trespassed on my private property multiple times after being asked not to. I have it on video. She's taken photos without permission and made false claims about code violations that don't exist. A woman in the third row raised her hand. Is it true you have junked vehicles on your property? We're concerned about breeding grounds for mosquitoes. I have 2 tractors and a restored 1967 Ford truck, all in working condition. Thomas replied. They're stored properly and pose no health risks. An older man spoke up from the side of the room. What about your fence? Patricia said it was falling down in places. I've been repairing sections of the fence that needed work, Thomas said. That's normal maintenance for a property this size, not a code violation. Patricia stood up, clearly unhappy with how the conversation was going. Mr. Wilson's 2 minutes are up. We need to move on with our agenda. One last thing, Thomas said, holding up the certified letter. I've sent Ms. Reynolds a legal cease and desist letter regarding her trespassing. I'm not looking for trouble with any of you. I just want to be left alone to enjoy my property in peace, the same as you all want to enjoy yours. As Thomas returned to his seat, he noticed several residents giving him thoughtful looks. A few even nodded in apparent understanding. The meeting concluded 30 minutes later. As people filed out, a couple of residents approached Thomas. I'm Robert Chen, said an older man, extending his hand. Bill's my cousin. He speaks highly of you. Thomas shook his hand. Nice to meet you. Just so you know, Robert said quietly. Not everyone here agrees with Patricia's approach to things. Some of us moved here for the rural setting, not to recreate downtown Houston. A woman joined them. I'm Linda Peterson. My husband and I live on the eastern edge of the subdivision, closest to your property. We've never had any issues with your ranch. Thomas thanked them both for their support. As he headed for the exit, he could feel Patricia's glare following him across the room. The next day, Thomas was working on his tractor when his phone chimed with a security alert. The camera at his gate showed Patricia's white SUV, along with 2 other vehicles he didn't recognize. Through the camera's microphone, he could hear Patricia speaking. This is the property I was telling you about. As you can see, the concerns in our newsletter were completely justified. Thomas watched as she entered the code for his gate, a code he'd only given to Bill and a couple of delivery services. Somehow, she'd gotten hold of his gate code, and now she was bringing reinforcements. Thomas watched the security feed with growing anger as Patricia led what appeared to be 2 county officials on a tour of his property. She moved with the confidence of someone who believed they had every right to be there, gesturing toward his barn and workshop as she spoke. Though the microphone couldn't pick up everything they were saying, he caught phrases like potential violations and community concerns. His first instinct was to drive straight home and confront them, but years of military training had taught him the value of strategy over impulse. Instead, he called Deputy Rodriguez directly. They're on my property right now, Thomas explained after describing the situation. 3 vehicles, including Patricia Reynolds. I have it all on camera. Are they damaging anything? The deputy asked. Not that I can see, but they're trespassing. I've sent her a cease and desist letter, posted signs, and changed my gate code. She somehow got the new code. Deputy Rodriguez sighed. I'll send someone out, but it'll be about 20 minutes. By the time Thomas arrived home, the deputy's patrol car was parked beside Patricia's SUV near his gate. As he pulled up, he could see Patricia gesturing animatedly while talking to the deputy. The 2 men with her stood awkwardly to the side, looking like they wished they were anywhere else. Thomas parked and approached the group, 2 jumping out of the truck behind him. Mr. Wilson, Deputy Rodriguez nodded in greeting. Ms. Reynolds was just explaining that she's here with county officials on official business. On my private property without my permission, Thomas pointed out. After receiving a legal cease and desist letter, Patricia lifted her chin. As I was explaining to the deputy, Mr. Cooper here is from the County Environmental Office and Mr. Diaz is from Building Code Enforcement. We've received complaints about potential violations on this property. Thomas turned to the two men. "Did either of you bring a warrant to inspect my property?" The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. The older of the two, Mr. Cooper, cleared his throat. "No, sir. Ms. Reynolds assured us she had permission to access the property." "She doesn't," Thomas said flatly. "And I'd like you all to leave now." "Now see here," Patricia began, but Deputy Rodriguez raised a hand to cut her off. "Ms. Reynolds, did you enter this property using a gate code that Mr. Wilson did not personally provide to you?" Patricia's face flushed. "The code was provided to me by a concerned resident who had legitimate business access to the property." "That's called unauthorized access," the deputy said, his voice professional but firm. "And after receiving a cease and desist letter, it could be construed as criminal trespass. I'm going to have to ask you and these gentlemen to leave the property immediately." The code enforcement officer didn't need to be told twice. He was already heading for his vehicle. The environmental officer paused long enough to hand Thomas a business card. "If you'd like to schedule an official inspection, sir, please contact our office directly. We'd be happy to work with you to address any concerns." Thomas thanked him, then turned his attention back to Patricia, who showed no signs of leaving. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low. "That eyesore of a barn is visible from 3 houses in our development. It's affecting property values." "Ms. Reynolds," Deputy Rodriguez said, "I need you to return to your vehicle now." With a final glare at Thomas, Patricia stalked back to her SUV. As she drove away, she rolled down her window. "I'll be back, Mr. Wilson. Count on it." After the deputy took Thomas's official statement and left, Thomas sat on his porch thinking. Patricia had proved more persistent than he'd anticipated. Changing the gate code hadn't worked. The cease and desist letter hadn't worked. Even involving law enforcement seemed only a temporary solution. He needed something more effective, something that would make Patricia think twice before entering his property again. That evening, Thomas pulled out his old military engineering manuals and began sketching designs. By midnight, he had a plan. It wouldn't be cheap and it would take some work, but it would solve his problem once and for all. The next morning, Thomas called his friend Jack Hudson, who ran a metal fabrication shop in town. "You want to build a what?" Jack asked after Thomas explained his idea. "A specialized cattle guard," Thomas repeated, "with some modifications." "Sounds more like a booby trap to me," Jack said, concern evident in his voice. "It's not a booby trap," Thomas assured him. "It won't cause any damage or injury. It's just designed to make an impression." Jack was quiet for a moment. "Bring your designs by the shop. Let me take a look before I agree to anything." An hour later, Thomas spread his sketches across Jack's workbench. Jack studied them carefully, occasionally asking questions about specific measurements or mechanisms. "This is actually pretty clever," he admitted finally. "It won't damage vehicles?" "Not if built to these specifications," Thomas confirmed. "It'll just create an unexpected dip, enough to startle someone who's not supposed to be there but not enough to cause any damage. And these sensors will recognize authorized vehicles?" Thomas nodded. "RFID tags, my truck, Bill's truck, regular delivery vehicles, they'll all pass over it normally. Only unauthorized vehicles will trigger the mechanism." Jack rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "It's gonna cost you. Those hydraulic pistons aren't cheap, and the control system will need to be custom built." "I've got savings," Thomas said. "This is worth it." Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas and Jack worked on building the specialized cattle guard. The basic structure was similar to standard cattle guards used throughout ranch country, a series of parallel metal tubes or pipes installed across the width of a driveway, creating a surface that vehicles can drive over but that cattle won't cross. The difference was in the details. Thomas's design incorporated a sensor system connected to hydraulic pistons that could slightly lower sections of the bars when triggered. The sensors would read RFID tags placed on authorized vehicles, allowing them to pass normally. Any vehicle without an authorized tag would trigger the mechanism. "It's really just a high-tech speed bump," Thomas explained to Bill when he came by to check on the progress. "Completely legal, completely safe, and completely unexpected for anyone who doesn't know it's there," Bill added with a grin. While Jack handled the metal fabrication, Thomas worked on the electronic components. His military experience with security systems proved invaluable as he wired the sensors and programmed the control unit. Finally, the day came to install the system. Jack brought the completed metal structure on his flatbed truck, and Thomas had already prepared the ground at his gate entrance. They spent a full day digging, pouring concrete, and setting the cattle guard in place with the control box hidden in a waterproof housing nearby. "Moment of truth," Jack said when everything was connected. "Want to test it?" Thomas nodded and climbed into his truck, which now had an RFID tag hidden behind the front license plate. He drove slowly toward the cattle guard, holding his breath as the front wheels rolled onto the metal bars. Nothing happened. The truck passed smoothly over the structure. Jack gave him a thumbs up, then climbed into his own vehicle, which didn't have an RFID tag. As Jack's truck approached the cattle guard, Thomas activated the system using his phone. When Jack's front wheels hit the center of the cattle guard, 3 sections of bars smoothly lowered by about 2 inches. It wasn't dramatic. The truck didn't lurch or bounce dramatically, but the unexpected dip was definitely noticeable. Jack's surprised expression said it all. "Well, I'll be damned," Jack said as he got out. "It works perfectly, just enough to make you think you're about to drop into a hole, but not enough to damage anything." Thomas nodded, satisfied. "And it's completely legal. Ranchers have been using cattle guards for 100 years. I've just modernized mine a bit." The next step was to make everything official. Thomas installed prominent signs on either side of his gate. "Warning, specialized security cattle guard in use, authorized vehicles only." He also filed paperwork with the county registering his enhanced livestock control device and had his lawyer review everything to ensure he was legally covered. "You've done everything by the book," Mike assured him during their phone call. "If she tries to raise a stink about this, she won't have a legal leg to stand on." For the next 3 days, Thomas kept a close eye on his security cameras. There was no sign of Patricia or her white SUV. He began to wonder if perhaps the deputy's warning had finally gotten through to her. Then, on the morning of the 4th day, Thomas got an alert on his phone. Patricia's SUV was at his gate. But this time she wasn't alone. 4 other vehicles were with her, all with Oak Ridge Estates. HOA parking stickers clearly visible through his security camera. Thomas watched as Patricia punched in his gate code. Apparently she hadn't believed he would change it again after the last incident. To his surprise, the gate swung open. He had indeed changed the code, but not to lock her out, to lure her in. Patricia's SUV led the small convoy through the open gate and toward the newly installed cattle guard. From his workshop where he'd been repairing a tractor engine, Thomas picked up his phone and opened the control app. "Let's see how you like my ranch hospitality, Ms. Reynolds," he murmured as he watched through the camera feed, his finger hovering over the activation button. The white SUV approached the cattle guard, moving faster than was wise on a rural driveway. Patricia clearly wasn't paying attention to the warning signs. She was too busy pointing out violations to her HOA committee members through her open window. Thomas pressed the button just as her front wheels hit the center of the cattle guard. The effect was immediate and exactly as Thomas had designed. As Patricia's SUV crossed the center of the cattle guard, 3 sections smoothly dropped by 2 inches. It wasn't much, just enough to create the sudden sensation that the vehicle was falling into a pit. Through the security camera, Thomas watched as Patricia's SUV lurched. He could almost imagine the startled expressions inside the vehicle. The SUV came to an abrupt stop, half on and half off the cattle guard. For several long moments, nobody moved. Then Patricia's driver's door swung open and she emerged looking visibly shaken. Her perfect blonde bob was slightly disheveled, and she clutched the door frame as if to steady herself. The passengers in the other vehicles stayed put, clearly uncertain about what had just happened or what to do next. Patricia looked down at the cattle guard, then at the warning signs Thomas had posted. Her face registered shock, then confusion, and finally anger. She pulled out her phone and appeared to be taking photos of the cattle guard. Thomas decided it was time to make his appearance. He climbed into his truck and drove down his driveway toward the gate. As he approached, he could hear Patricia's voice rising in pitch. "This is outrageous," she was saying to one of her companions who had finally ventured out of their car. "It's a booby trap. He could have killed us all." Thomas parked his truck and stepped out, Duke following at his heels. "Good morning, Ms. Reynolds," he said calmly. "I see you've encountered my new security cattle guard." Patricia whirled to face him. You, she sputtered. This thing almost flipped my car. I could have been seriously injured. The cattle guard is perfectly safe when used properly, Thomas replied, gesturing to the warning signs. As you can see, I've posted clear notices. And if you'd been driving at an appropriate speed for a private driveway, you'd have barely noticed the dip. One of the HOA committee members, a middle-aged man in khakis and a golf shirt, had gotten out to examine the cattle guard. It looks like a standard cattle guard to me, he said, sounding confused. We have similar ones at my brother's place in Colorado. It's not standard, Patricia insisted. The middle dropped when I drove over it. It's some kind of trap. It's a specialized livestock control device, properly registered with the county, Thomas explained, pulling out his phone to show the committee member the registration documentation. The system is designed to allow authorized vehicles to pass normally while discouraging unauthorized access. It's completely legal and poses no danger to vehicles driven responsibly. The man looked impressed despite himself. Some kind of sensor system? Thomas nodded. RFID tags for authorized vehicles. My truck passes over it without activating the mechanism. By now, the other committee members had emerged from their vehicles and gathered around the cattle guard, examining it with more curiosity than alarm. Patricia was having none of it. I'm calling the sheriff right now. This is a criminal act. Feel free, Thomas said with a shrug. Deputy Rodriguez is already familiar with the situation, including your repeated trespassing on my property after receiving a cease and desist letter. While Patricia made her call, an older woman from the committee approached Thomas. I'm Nancy Williams, she said quietly. I've been on the fence about all this, to be honest. Patricia can be very determined when she sets her mind on something, I've noticed. Thomas replied dryly. Nancy glanced back at Patricia, who was still on the phone, then lowered her voice further. Between you and me, many of us in Oak Ridge are getting tired of her heavy-handed approach. This vendetta against your property is just the latest example. Before Thomas could respond, a patrol car pulled up outside his gate. To his relief, it was Deputy Rodriguez who stepped out. The deputy took in the scene, Patricia gesturing wildly at the cattle guard, the cluster of HOA committee members, and Thomas standing calmly with Duke at his side. What seems to be the problem here? Deputy Rodriguez asked, though his expression suggested he had a pretty good idea. Patricia launched into an explanation, her words tumbling over each other in her agitation. He installed a dangerous trap on his driveway. My vehicle nearly rolled over. He deliberately lured us onto his property to spring this trap on us. Deputy Rodriguez turned to Thomas. Is this the security cattle guard you filed paperwork for last week? Thomas nodded. Properly registered and posted with warning signs as required by county ordinance. The deputy examined the cattle guard and the signs, then pulled Thomas aside. You're within your rights, he said quietly. But you're playing with fire here. Ms. Reynolds has connections. I understand, Thomas replied. But so do I. 20 years in the military taught me a thing or two about dealing with difficult situations and difficult people. Deputy Rodriguez couldn't quite suppress a smile. I'll need to file a report about this incident. Can you demonstrate how this system works? Thomas showed him the app on his phone and explained the mechanism. To demonstrate, he had the deputy drive his patrol car over the cattle guard with the system activated. The slight dip was noticeable but far from dangerous. As you can see, Thomas concluded, at a reasonable speed it's perfectly safe. It just creates an unexpected sensation that tends to discourage unwanted visitors. The deputy nodded. Ms. Reynolds, I don't see any violation here. Mr. Wilson has registered his livestock control device properly, and the warning signs are clearly posted. The fact remains that you entered his property without permission, despite a previous warning and a cease and desist letter. Patricia's face flushed with anger. This isn't over, she hissed at Thomas. The HOA board will be hearing about this. To her evident surprise, Nancy stepped forward. Actually, Patricia, I think the board has heard quite enough. I move that we discontinue any action regarding Mr. Wilson's property, effective immediately. One by one, the other committee members nodded in agreement. You can't do that, Patricia protested. We haven't had a formal vote. Then let's have one now, Nancy suggested calmly. All in favor of leaving Mr. Wilson and his property alone from this point forward? 4 hands went up, leaving Patricia standing alone. This is irregular, she sputtered. It needs to be properly documented. I'll draw up the minutes when we get back, Nancy assured her. Now I suggest we all return to Oak Ridge and leave Mr. Wilson in peace. Patricia looked from face to face, apparently realizing she'd lost her support. Without another word, she stalked back to her SUV. I'll pull forward so you can back up and turn around, Thomas offered, walking to his truck. He drove across the cattle guard, which remained stable under his authorized vehicle, and parked on the other side. One by one, the HOA members carefully backed up and turned their vehicles around, giving the cattle guard a wide berth. Patricia was the last to leave, gunning her engine as she drove away in a spray of gravel. As the dust settled, Deputy Rodriguez approached Thomas again. "Impressive engineering," he commented. "Mind if I ask where you learned to build something like that?" "Army Corps of Engineers," Thomas replied. 20 years of figuring out how to solve problems with limited resources in difficult conditions. The deputy nodded appreciatively. "Well, I think you may have solved your HOA problem for good. Still, keep those security cameras running just in case." After the deputy left, Thomas walked back to his gate, Duke trotting beside him. He looked at the cattle guard with satisfaction. It had worked exactly as designed, not causing any harm but definitely making an impression. Over the next few weeks, Thomas watched as word of the Trapdoor spread through the community. Bill reported that it had become something of a local legend, with various embellished versions of what happened to Patricia's SUV circulating at the feed store and local diner. Patricia herself never returned to Thomas's property. According to Nancy Williams, who stopped by one day to drop off a homemade apple pie, Patricia had been voted out as HOA president at the next board meeting. "We appointed Robert Chen instead," Nancy explained as Thomas invited her in for coffee. "He's much more reasonable, believes in live and let live, especially when it comes to properties that aren't even part of our HOA." Thomas's victory over the HOA had an unexpected side effect. Several of his neighbors with similar issues began installing their own versions of security cattle guards, though none quite as sophisticated as his. The local newspaper even ran a small article about the trend, referring to it as the cattle guard revolution. 6 months later, Thomas sat on his porch watching the sunset, a cold beer in his hand and Duke at his feet. The barn renovation was finally complete, the fence repairs finished, and he'd even added a small vegetable garden behind the house. In the distance, he could see the rooftops of Oak Ridge Estates. Under Robert's leadership, the HOA had shifted its focus to community improvement rather than policing neighboring properties. They'd even invited Thomas to their summer barbecue, an invitation he had surprised himself by accepting. As twilight deepened into night, Thomas reflected on the strange chain of events that had led him here. 20 years in the military had prepared him for many things, but dealing with an HOA Karen hadn't been one of them. Yet the same skills had served him well: patience, strategy, and the ability to engineer a solution to a difficult problem. Duke suddenly lifted his head, ears perked toward the gate. A car was approaching, Bill's truck, according to the security app on Thomas's phone. The gate swung open and the truck passed smoothly over the cattle guard. Thomas smiled and stood up to greet his friend. The cattle guard had done its job. His land was his own, his boundaries respected at last, and that was worth every penny and every hour he'd invested in his unconventional solution.